You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Just recently, I had the great pleasure of joining in on a Zoom meeting in which my brother Gary received a Community Service Award. And I have to tell you, he's the kind of guy that is well deserving of it. He goes above and beyond for everyone. Now, we were each asked to introduce ourselves and to describe our favorite place in nature. And when it was my turn, I commented that my favorite place was to sit on the remnants of an old dam that stood a bit upstream from my parents' old house in Thompsonville, New York. That's in the Catskill Mountains. Anyway, getting to the dam involved walking through the woods for a distance and then climbing down the cliff face to get to the dam. And you could only get to it when the water level was low. Now, I should point out it wasn't nearly as dangerous as it may sound, but I just love sitting on that dam. And that's because I was surrounded by nature. You know, the water is just flowing around. There are cliffs to one side. It was incredibly peaceful. Occasionally, as I'd wander through the woods to get there, I would wonder if I could actually survive alone in nature all by myself, kind of a survivor type situation. And during my teenage years, I was foolish enough to think that I could. But now, decades later, I am doubtful I would have survived. Of course, there have been many, many stories of people, both real and fictional, who have found themselves in some sort of struggle for survival. The 2000 movie Castaway starring Tom Hanks is one that comes to mind. In that film, the FedEx airplane he's aboard crashes in the Pacific and he's forced to spend the next 4 years alone on an uninhabited tropical island. But we all know it's a Hollywood film, so from the very beginning I was certain that Tom Hanks' character would be rescued. But I have to tell you, the struggle for survival, that was what made the movie so interesting. Honestly, throughout the entire movie, all I could think is, what would I do if I were in his shoes? But, of course, not everyone ends up on a tropical island. Imagine a scenario in which an airplane crashes into the icy waters off the coast of Greenland just as winter's about to set in. The crew, it's forced onto an island that has absolutely nothing. There's no firewood, no animals, no plants, no caves. There's barely a flat spot to lie down on. There's just lots of ice, snow, and bad weather. Now, do you think you could survive? I don't think I could. Well, today I have for you a long-forgotten true story from 1943 in which 3 airmen found themselves exactly in this predicament. And worst of all, after a few days, they knew perfectly well that the military had given up the search for them. What you're about to hear is an incredible story of struggle, lost hope, and perhaps, just perhaps, even a miracle or two. I really do think you're going to enjoy this one. I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
Excluding the hassles of airport security, it's relatively easy to fly anywhere today. For example, I can hop on an airplane here in New York and be in Europe in about 7 hours. That's truly amazing when one stops to think that transatlantic flight was nearly impossible when World War II began in 1939. And yes, there certainly were airplanes that could make the trip, but in general, they were the exception to the rule. Then after the fall of Denmark, Norway, France, and other European countries to Hitler's Germany in the spring of 1940, Great Britain suddenly found itself standing nearly alone. It found itself in desperate need of airplanes to assist in its fight against the Nazis. And just who could supply them with more planes? Do you have an answer? You're correct. The United States. But getting airplanes from the United States was a slow and costly undertaking. That's because the bombers needed to be partially disassembled so they could fit inside the cargo holds of ships. Then, after a lengthy trip across the Atlantic, the airplanes needed to be unloaded, reassembled, and test flown, and that's all before they could be turned over to the various RAF units. As slow as this all was, things got far worse when German U-boats began to send these transport ships and their precious cargo and crew to the ocean floor. This, coupled with the fact that the British were losing airplanes at an alarming rate, it forced them to seek out an alternative way to get those aircraft across the ocean. Of course, from today's vantage point, the answer is straightforward. Just skip the ocean transport and fly the machines over to Europe. But as I mentioned, that wasn't easily done in 1940. The solution came in reducing the flight distance from the United States to Great Britain. Well, not exactly. You can't change the actual physical distance. But one can take advantage of flying the shortest distance between two continents. The plan was to fly the airplanes from Gander Airport in Newfoundland, Canada, across the ocean to Northern Ireland. And I should note that this was essentially the same flight path that the first transatlantic flights had taken. Total distance, 1,900 miles, or around 3,060 kilometers. This may surprise you, but that's nearly 45% less distance than when flying from New York to London. But the question was, could it be done with airplanes that were built for warfare, not necessarily for these lengthy type flights? The answer was yes. In November 1947, Lockheed Hudson bombers successfully made the trip, and after that, what was known as the North Atlantic Air Ferry Service began between the two continents. Without a doubt, this was considered dangerous business, but Great Britain was willing to accept an astonishing 50% loss of aircrew and aircraft. They were that desperate. An interesting side note to this was that the whole scheme required circumvention of U.S. neutrality laws. They prohibited the export of, quote, arms, ammunition, and implements of war, unquote, to any foreign nation at war. And of course, Great Britain was at war, so they weren't entitled to any of this stuff. Well, to get around this, after a bomber was completed by Lockheed in California, it was flown to Pembina, North Dakota, which was right on the Canadian-U.S. border. Then ropes were attached to the airplanes and they were pulled, and get this, they were pulled sometimes by horses. There are photos of this. They were pulled right over the border, then they were flown to Montreal, and then finally onto Newfoundland. Of course, not all aircraft could make the long journey from Newfoundland to Great Britain. In fact, no plane could fly the opposite way because they were flying into the wind and used more fuel. So intermediate airports needed to be set up along the way, and those were in Greenland and Iceland. Soon another challenge emerged, and that was airplane production soon outstripped the availability of crews to fly the planes. The problem was that sending these men back to Montreal, where the North American ferry operation was headquartered, took far too long and was far too dangerous. That's because they were sending them on ships. To address this issue, starting in May 1941, the crews were transported back to Montreal aboard modified bombers. And when I say modified, they basically just ripped out the bomb gear and put some benches and some mattresses in there, and that's how they flew back. By the fall of 1943, the RAF began phasing out their first-generation bombers. They were the twin-engine Handley Page Hamptons, which were being replaced by the more advanced four-engine Avro Lancasters. The Hamptons, however, were not destined for the scrapyard. They weren't being junked. Instead, those ferry crews were now tasked with flying those battle-worn aircraft over to Canada. And when they got there, the intention was to repurpose them as training airplanes, giving them a new lease on life. Every single one of those Hampton bombers successfully completed their journey to Canada except for one. That aircraft, which went down on October 14th of 1943, it was piloted by 32-year-old Captain Robert E. Kaufman of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Up in the clear plastic nose of the aircraft was its navigator, 23-year-old Norman E. or Ted Greenaway of Camrose, Alberta. Ted joined up with the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1941, and once he became part of the Atlantic Ferry Command, he relocated to Montreal with his wife and infant daughter. Now, that little detail that his wife and infant daughter were living in Montreal, that will play a small part later in the story. And the third and final crew member that I'd like you to meet is 22-year-old Ronald E. Snow of Digby, Nova Scotia. He was a former merchant marine wireless operator, and it was his job to man the airplane's communications system. Their flight plan for that Thursday was straightforward. They were to fly the plane from Reykjavik, Iceland to Bluey West 1, which was a U.S. Army air base near the southern tip of Greenland and built specifically for this North Atlantic ferry route. The 800-mile or nearly 1,300-kilometer journey was fairly routine for Captain Kaufman. He was a former Transcontinental and Western Air, or TWA, pilot who had also previously completed 23 of these round trips across the Atlantic. But this flight, it would prove to be anything but routine. They were around 3 hours into their 5-hour flight, traveling at an altitude of 12,000 feet, or about 3.7 kilometers, and suddenly they heard a loud grinding noise that could be heard coming from one of the engines. Then moments later, the engine disintegrated. At this point, they were about 1 hour from the Greenland coast. Kaufman figured that he could keep the airplane going that long, but he also knew that once he reached the coast, he'd be faced with a wall of mountains that just jutted out of the barren landscape below. There were only 2 ways for him to get the airplane to Bluey West, and both options presented him with insurmountable obstacles. The first was to fly over the mountains, but there was no way he could do that on one engine. The plane had already dropped 3,000 feet, or around 915 meters. Option 2 was to fly to the coast, then head south and go around the mountains, but he concluded that he lacked the fuel needed to do so. He grimly informed Greenaway and Snow.
"We'll go as far as we can and then come down in the sea."
Now, if they got lucky, maybe they could make the coast, follow it southward, and ultimately find a smooth place to land. But the reality of them ever finding a place to land in this barren, icy world, well, it was nearly zilch. So over the next hour, Kaufman held the bomber on course for the Greenland coast, but he continued to lose elevation. They had dropped from 9,000 to 4,500 feet. Roughly, that's 2,700 to 1,350 meters. In other words, they lost half their altitude. Then, suddenly the plane flipped over on its right wing and began spiraling violently toward the icy waters below. Greenaway, who was now staring directly at the ocean through the plane's clear plastic nose, he was forced forward and gashed his leg against the navigation table. Meanwhile, radio operator Snow clung to that Morse code key, and he desperately attempted to send out one final SOS. But he was well aware that his effort was in vain, and that's because they entered a shortwave radio dead zone, and it made it unlikely that anyone would ever receive their urgent call for help. With all his strength, Kaufman pushed the stick forward and slammed both feet onto the port rudder. And slowly the aircraft began to respond. They were at less than 1,000 feet or 300 meters when he finally managed to level off. But 20 minutes later, that tiring other engine, it failed. Of course, Kaufman had no choice but to land the plane, but the question was where? All he saw were chunks of ice and icebergs everywhere that he looked. He concluded his only option was to head for the fringe of the ice and bring the plane down there. They made certain to take note of their exact coordinates and made another attempt to send out an SOS. And as anticipated, that message was lost in the ether. He attempted to gently set the plane down, but as Kaufman approached the water's surface, the craft just dropped out of the sky like a stone. The nose of the plane was instantly submerged, and the 3 men raced to get out. Greenaway instinctively grabbed the emergency bag, and then he followed Captain Kaufman through the escape hatch. As for Snow, he made his way out through a rear hatch. And there they were. All 3 men were standing on one of the airplane's wings, but they realized they didn't have very long. That's because the crash had caused the Hampton's bomb bay to burst open, and the plane was quickly filling with water. Amazingly, the impact had jarred a rubber dinghy loose from its storage compartment. And as it hit the water, its seal dissolved in the lifeboat. It went, it instantly inflated. So they scrambled aboard as Kaufman grabbed the dinghy knife and cut it free from the sinking bomber. And just as they were moving away, about 70 seconds after they ditched the plane, they watched the aircraft disappear beneath the waves. The last thing that they saw go under the water was the aircraft's twin tail. Kaufman looked around and noticed that several wooden planks had broken off the plane, so he told his companions to grab one piece each. And that's because he had a gut feeling that they'd be more effective than the canvas paddles that the dinghy was equipped with. It wouldn't be easy to get to the coastline. They needed to row through an estimated 15 miles or 21.4 kilometers of pack ice. Think about that. Anyway, two of the men would row and the other one would use one of those pieces of lumber or even their hands at times to keep the ice away from the dinghy. The last thing that they wanted to do was puncture the rubber raft. They would be goners if they did. The cold was so intense that it was impossible for anyone to sleep. So they made steady progress through the remainder of the day and then through the entire night, using the light of the moon to show them the way. And when the sun rose the next morning, they could see that their bright yellow boat had turned white from all of the salt water that had frozen to it. Then, at 10 a.m., about 20 hours after their plane went down, strong coastal currents grabbed hold of their raft and began to speed it up. Caught up in the rapids, they were pulled towards this monstrous black rock that jutted out of the ocean. And when I say monstrous, I'm talking about the peak of a mountain. It was clear they were going to crash, so they jumped out of the boat just as it touched land. Now, Kaufman and Snow had no difficulty making the leap, but Greenaway, he had that injured leg and it prevented him from doing the same. He landed in the water submerged up to his hips, but he was able to reach for the rock and haul himself out. This giant black rock, as they called it, it turned out to be the island of Umanisuk, which roughly translates as shaped like a big heart. And they were just a short distance from the mainland, but they quickly realized there was no way to traverse the raging rapids that separated them from it. Unfortunately, they were stuck on Umanisuk. Here's how Kaufman described their initial impressions of the island.
Our hearts sank when we saw the type of country we had landed in. There was nothing but barren land without the sign of anything but snow. We made our way to a black rock 50 yards from shore. It turned out to be the 3,000-foot pinnacle of an 11,000-foot mountain. The rock rose sheer from the ocean, but finally we managed to get ashore near the only cave which would admit us.
They proceeded to explore the island and found absolutely nothing but ice and snow. Not a single piece of firewood could be located. There were no plants, no animals. Even the opening in the cave that they had hoped to use as shelter proved too small to crawl through. They had no choice but to camp on a narrow ledge perched about 100 feet or 30 meters above the waterline. For shelter, they hauled their rubber dinghy up, flipped it over, and crawled beneath it. And the biting cold, remember they had no source of heat, the biting cold forced them to cut slits in their flying suits, and that allowed them to face one another and slide their legs inside their companion's suit for warmth. Their first day in Umanisuk was bright and sunny, so they took off their boots and socks, laying them out in the sun to dry. They then proceeded to take inventory of their supplies, and I have to tell you, they didn't have much. For signaling, they had a very pistol, what we call a flare gun, and 27 cartridges for that gun. They also had a distress flag and a heliograph, what we today call a signaling mirror. Then there were 3 small containers, one for each man, and they held 45 malted milk tablets, 4 squares of barley, chewing gum, and a vial of benzodrine tablets. Between them, they also had 12 pints or 5.7 liters of water and a first aid kit. And lastly, they had some waterlogged chocolate that had been in their pockets. That's it. It was clear that if they weren't rescued soon, the 3 were going to starve to death. So they drew up a ration schedule that limited each man to 6 malted milk tablets and a third of a pint or 158 milliliters of water per day. However, as we'll soon see, the search for them would soon be called off. After 3 days, they further reduced their daily intake to 3 malted milk tablets and a tiny postage stamp-sized piece of chocolate. Try living on that. Meanwhile, back in Montreal, a large-scale air search and rescue was immediately launched. Planes were dispatched from Iceland, Labrador, and Newfoundland, but they had difficulty in searching the area. Initially, the biggest obstacle was the mountains themselves. The airplanes were forced to fly at such high altitudes to clear them that they had difficulty in seeing anything that was happening down on the ground. Coupled with that was the fact that the weather began to take a turn for the worse. Down on the ground, the castaways could hear the airplanes. According to Ted Greenaway,
the first day on the ledge saw the first rescue plane go over. I think it was a Liberator. We grabbed the heliograph and started sending signals for all we were worth, but it was useless. The weather closed in and spoiled all efforts of attracting attention. I used the very pistol, a small gun used for rescue work, but the low ceiling made it useless. All we could do was stand helplessly by and watch the plane fly over our heads and away.
Later that day, they spotted a second plane, but once again, they were unable to signal it, so it just flew away. They estimated that both had been flying at 11,000 feet or 3.35 kilometers. So neither the flare guns nor the signaling mirrors seemed to be helping, but they still had the distress flag. They thought if they could get high enough on the mountain, perhaps a distant boat or low-flying aircraft would be able to see it. So Kaufman and Snow attempted to climb up, but frostbite was already beginning to take its toll. Kaufman found it very difficult to climb with his frozen feet, but Snow was able to get up near the summit and plant that flag. Sadly, it would blow away in the next storm. Although the first day was sunny, a severe blizzard swept in on days 2 and 3. This was followed by 2 days of sub-zero temperatures, which turned their wet clothing into stiff, frozen boards. Of course, the relentless storms also meant that no one would be able to see them, and any chance of rescue, well, that was delayed indefinitely. Next came 3 days of gale-force winds, which brought icy water up to the ledge where they were sheltering. They had no choice but to move even higher on the mountain, again dragging their rubber boat up to use as shelter. Meanwhile, back in Montreal, the search was abandoned. The 3 airmen, well, they were presumed dead. Ted Greenaway's wife, now facing the prospect of raising their baby alone, decided to return home to Alberta. There she could get much-needed help from family and friends, so she packed up all their belongings and had them shipped home. After that, she purchased train tickets for herself and their daughter. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the world, the men were alive on Umanersuck, but they were fully aware of the fact that they were probably going to die there. Winter, well, it was setting in and there wouldn't be any ships in the area until spring. Yet they were certain that someday someone would find their frozen bodies, and they wanted to leave some sort of message to let them know what happened. But when they searched their pockets for paper, all they found were a few scraps, and they were just soaked to a pulp. In addition, even if they had found some paper, they were incredibly fatigued, and their fingers, well, they were too numb to hold a pencil. Ultimately, they concluded that if found, their corpses could be identified by their dog tags. Well, the weather finally cleared up on the 8th day. That's when they spotted a ship sailing away from Greenland. So they fired the very pistol, but its flares failed to get the ship's attention. Just imagine their disappointment as they watched it sail out of sight. Even worse, the same exact thing happened the next day. Then, at sunrise on day 10, they heard an airplane flying high overhead. And once again they fired off the flares, but quickly realized they couldn't be seen through the low-lying clouds. Dejected, the 3 returned to their dinghy, and somehow they found humor in the fact that they all had a middle name that began with the letter E. But by this point they were incredibly weak and barely had the strength to crawl. By far, Captain Kaufman was in the worst shape and close to death. Around noon that day, he complained about a burning thirst, so Snow crawled out from under the boat to go get him some water. But less than a minute later, Snow returned and said,
"Say, boys, I'm awfully queer and maybe seeing things, but I think there's a ship out there standing still."
They then lifted one edge of the dinghy to peer out at the sea, and initially they were blinded by the strong sunlight, but once their eyes adjusted, they were able to refocus. And there it was, way out in the distance, about 8 miles or 12.9 kilometers out, there was a small ship. They were all incredibly weak, but they did everything that they could to get the attention of the ship. They shouted and screamed despite knowing that it was unlikely anyone would ever hear them. Of course, they continuously flashed their signaling mirror, but the biting cold forced them to take turns while the others warmed their hands. Basically, the metal was too cold to hold. Desperate, they even tried firing the very pistol, even though their supply of cartridges was nearly depleted. Fully aware that this was their last chance at rescue, they kept at it for 3 hours, and no one saw them. Their hope, it soon gave way to despair. The ship was later identified as the Norwegian Polar Bjorn, or Polar Bear, and it was the last scheduled ship to pass along Greenland's east coast that year. A 260-ton converted whaling vessel, it had been experiencing engine trouble, and that prompted the captain to steer it closer to shore for protection during repairs. Unfortunately, no one spotted the 3 castaways, and that's because the entire crew was below deck in the engine room. Now, there were 2 passengers aboard, but they were resting in their bunks. Both were members of the U.S. Army, and they were returning from a radio station in the northeastern portion of Greenland. One of those men, Major John T. Crowell, decided to step onto the deck to take in the scenery. And as he scanned the distance, a flash of light caught his eye, and he initially assumed that was sunlight reflecting off the ice of the mountains. Curious, he grabbed his binoculars to take a closer look. Then suddenly he spotted what appeared to be a puff of smoke followed by another flash of light. And at first he thought it might be the reflection from a bird, but when that object just dropped straight down at great speed, he realized that couldn't be. Unbeknownst to him, he had just witnessed Captain Kaufman firing the very last flare from his very pistol. So Crowell refocused his binoculars and pinpointed the exact location of the light flashes. It was clearly some sort of signal being sent. Unsure of what this all meant, he went to see the ship's captain, who suggested 2 possibilities as to what could be going on. It was well known by this point that the Nazis had been setting up weather stations in Greenland, so it was possible that they were attempting to send a message to a U-boat that was in the area. But another thought was that the Nazis were attempting to trick him and have him sail the ship in towards the shore. Crowell's reaction was immediate. He knew they needed to go capture those Nazis. So a small boat was launched with Crowell and 3 of the Norwegian sailors aboard. Armed with guns and knives, Crowell kept a constant eye on the island through his field glasses. Here's Ted Greenaway describing what happened next.
Suddenly, when all hope of them seeing us appeared gone, we saw a little boat coming toward us. We were so far gone we were uncertain whether the men in it were rowing or what they were doing. Waiting for it to come up, we agreed the men were rowing. Actually, they were coming toward us with an outboard motor. It really showed us how far our minds had gone.
Once Crowell got close enough, he realized that those supposed Nazis were really 3 almost dead airmen. So they lowered their weapons and raced in to rescue them. The problem was that they were having a tough time getting the boat close enough to the men. So Crowell suggested that the castaways move to a more suitable location, but Kaufman said they were simply too weak to do so. Kaufman later told reporters,
The Norwegians gave us ropes to put around our waists. Then, by the nicest piece of seamanship I've ever seen, they maneuvered their craft right under the sheer face of the rock. As this would carry the boat high, they jerked us off one at a time into the arms of a big Norwegian in the stern. He handled us gently as babies, and we were uninjured by our fall. The boat all the time ran the risk of being dashed to pieces against the rock.
The rescue men were brought aboard the ship and offered coffee. However, before brewing was completed, exhaustion overtook them and they fell asleep. By the time they woke, the ship's engines had been repaired and they were en route to a nearby fjord, which just happened to be home to a small U.S. Army station. Meanwhile, a telegraph message had been sent ahead requesting immediate medical assistance, And that prompted 2 American soldiers with medical training to travel overland to tend to the 3 airmen. Meanwhile, the men were in dire condition, all 3 suffering from severe frostbite. Their feet, they were so badly swollen that their boots needed to be cut off. Kaufman's weight, it dropped by 32 pounds or 14.5 kilograms, while the other 2 had lost 25 pounds or 11.3 kilograms each. Their emaciated bodies were covered in bruises, and that's the result of enduring 10 days on the cold, jagged rocks. Greenaway, who had sustained that gashed leg during the plane crash, was in the worst shape. Now get this, the medical officers determined that if they had not been rescued when they were, the men likely would not have survived more than another 48 hours. Back in Montreal, Mrs. Greenaway was just about to leave her apartment to board the train that would take her back home to Alberta. And that's when a messenger showed up at her door to share the incredible news that her husband and his companions had been rescued. She must have been jumping for joy. After initial treatment, the men were moved to a Greenland military base, and once stable enough to travel, they were flown to the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal for further care. But amid the chaos of a world war, their story quickly faded from the headlines, so it's really hard to tell what happened after this. The few reports I could find indicated that Kaufman and Snow recovered quickly from their injuries, but Greenaway faced a much longer road to recovery, supposedly spending the next 12 months in the hospital. A quick check on Ancestry shows that each man went on to live relatively long lives. Captain Kaufman was 80 when he passed away in 1991. Ted Greenaway was the same exact age when he died on September 11th of 2000. And finally, Ronald Snow enjoyed the longest life, passing away on his 91st birthday, December 3rd, 2011. You know, it might seem strange to consider crashing a plane in the Arctic and barely surviving on a desolate island as lucky. Yet as I delved further and further into the story, I began to ponder a number of, what-if questions in my head. What if something didn't happen? For example, what if it had crashed way out in the open ocean, far away from any land? Or what if their injuries had been much more severe? Or what if they had crashed at night without the full moon to illuminate the hazards around them? And then think about it, what if the ship, the last one passing through those waters for the season, hadn't had the engine troubles that brought it closer to shore? Or what if Snow hadn't ventured out at that exact moment to fetch the water for Captain Kaufman? Or what if Major Crowell hadn't stepped on the deck to admire the scenery? And what if they had already used their last very pistol signaling cartridge? And the last thought that went through my head is, what if they didn't have that simple 7-cent signaling mirror? Now, 7 cents is about $1.28, but either way, what if they didn't have that mirror? So I don't know if one could call them lucky, but the stars clearly needed to be in perfect alignment for these 3 airmen to be rescued. Yet it does leave me with one haunting question. That is, how many other airmen in similar situations were never found at all? Well, I'll leave you with one final quote from Captain Kaufman.
It was nothing short of a miracle. How I lived through it, I'll never know, but believe me, I'm mighty glad I did.
Useless, useful, I'll leave that for you to decide. I must say that I've read many, many survival stories over the years, and this is by far one of my favorites. Yet what I find most interesting is that it's rarely ever mentioned in collections of survival stories. It really is one of those that's been mostly lost to history. That is, until now. Now, if you also found this story fascinating, maybe it could help me grow my audience by sharing it with someone else. And typically most podcasters suggest that you go write a review on Apple or Spotify, but that takes time, and I have a simpler suggestion. My guess is you have your phone in your hands or within arm's length right at this very moment. So all you need to do is text someone who you think might enjoy hearing this story right now, and that will help me spread the word. And I do thank you for doing that. Now, with the holidays approaching, here's a quick reminder. I've written 3 books filled with true stories like the one you just heard. They are Einstein's Refrigerator, Lindbergh's Artificial Heart, and my latest, which is The Flip Side of History. And yes, they're all written by me, Steve Silverman, and they're available through all book resellers. Let me tell you, they make fantastic gifts. Hint, hint. Lastly, the Useless Information Podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. So be sure to visit airwavemedia.com where you will find a curated selection of some of the best podcasts out there. Now, I'll be back shortly with some Christmas stories, but until then, thanks for listening and take care, everyone. Bye.